Hello AP Biology students, let's take a look at the third section in Unit 7. And in this section, we're going to go over natural selection and artificial selection. When Darwin returned from his trip, he started gathering evidence and corresponding with other scientists. One of these scientists was a naturalist by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was also a naturalist who was looking at how species changed based on environmental factors. His research was conducted when he was on a voyage in the Malay Archipelago. There is a whole separate story that I'm not going to get into about how he also independently came up with a theory of natural selection. But basically, he sent a manuscript of his work to Darwin to kind of look over and see what he thought. This led to Darwin kind of quickly publishing his work after he found out that Wallace was also going to come to the same conclusion. Because in a lot of things, the person that first discovers something is the one that's known or remembered. Oddly, Wallace gave credit to Darwin because Darwin had gathered so much evidence and came to this conclusion years earlier. He just hadn't published his work. Before I get into natural selection, I'd like to talk about artificial selection. Artificial selection occurs when humans control which organisms reproduce in a population. This increases the rate of or frequency of a desired trait. You can see in our diagram here, we have variation in this plant species, and a farmer is going to choose the plants that have the most growth. He'll choose these plants to be the parents of the next generation, which is subsequently larger. Now again, there is still variation, but this is going to subsequently change the frequency of a desired trait in the next generation. This is how different vegetables such as cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, and kale were produced. They were selected for from a wild mustard plant, and they were selected for different parts. Over many generations of farmers selecting for different variations, we have now all these different types of vegetables, but they come from an original single species. This is also true for dogs that were once from an ancient wolf species. Through the selection of different adaptations in these dogs, we now have hundreds of breeds of different dogs. The reason why I like to go over artificial selection first is because it helps these students understand what natural selection is, because artificial selection and natural selection are so similar. The main difference is what is the selection pressure being placed on the species. And in this case, in natural selection, it is usually environmental factors. So for natural selection, remember that organisms are going to exhibit variation between generations. And these organisms are going to compete for limited resources. Individuals in those populations are going to differ in how well they survive and reproduce. As you can see in our beetle species, we have two different colors of beetles, green and tan. Because the birds eat the green beetles more often, they're going to drastically decrease in the popularity in a population and eventually die out. This change in the frequency of an adaptation is evolution. I like these little diagrams that help students understand natural selection. Where we originally have variation in a population, some organisms are not going to survive and reproduce while others do. Again, we have variation. Some organisms don't survive while others do. And you can see after several generations, our species has changed. Darwin outlined his understanding of natural selection in a book called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, and it was published on November 24th, 1859. Remember that Darwin was not the first scientist to describe how species changed. Darwin was the most correct with how species changed. And he also backed it up with tons of research and evidence. I have to throw this meme in here. I know I use the Spider-Man meme too much, but it's just too good.